good evening, depending on where you're coming from. Thank you for joining us. My name is Laila Partridge, and we're going to be talking about energy and electrification and batteries and autonomous vehicles this morning. So, with that, let me start with some logistics. There is a chat on the right-hand side. Feel free to enter any questions. If you're joining us on the live stream from LinkedIn or from YouTube, just put the questions in chat and we will get to them. If you're actually on the Crowdcast platform, there's a little section underneath that says Ask a Question. You can also put your questions in there, and we will intersperse and pull them in as we speak. My name is Laila Partridge. I'm the Managing Director from Stanley Techstars Accelerator, and I'll talk a little more about my background, and I'm going to go counterclockwise. Audun, and please introduce yourself.
Sure. So my name is Audun Abelsnes, the guy with the world's most difficult name to pronounce, from Norway. So I'm the Managing Director of the Equinor and Techstars Energy Accelerator based out of Oslo in Norway.
Rishabh, next.
Hey, hello everyone. My name is Rishabh. I'm the CEO at Peer Robotics, and we are a collaborative mobile robotics company based out of India, but also operating in US.
Ryan, last but not least.
I'm Ryan Brown, co-founder of Salient Energy, based out of San Francisco. I went through Techstars Energy a couple years ago, and we're in the business of making better batteries for the grid.
Fantastic. So just to kick us off, I'm going to talk a little bit about Techstars, then I'm going to talk a little bit about my program. Audun, I'll let you talk about yours, and then we'll just kick it off with a bunch of questions. Techstars has been around for 15 years. We run 49 accelerators in 22 countries all over the world. We have over 2,600 alumni. Many of them started with us at the seed stage and have grown to be several, I think, 15 unicorns at this point, Audun? I can't remember that exact stat. But we've raised a lot of money in terms of over 2.7 billion in funding, and we have a number of companies who are exited. About 85% of our companies have had a liquidity event or are still around, so we're pretty proud of those numbers. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Audun. You might know the stats better than I do. That's good. All right, good. I work with Stanley Black & Decker, so we have two types of accelerators. One is a city program where a managing director like myself or Audun has a location, and they choose whatever topics they want to bring their founders in on. I work in partnership with Stanley Black & Decker, and so Stanley Black & Decker chooses a theme and works extremely closely with the companies while in program as well as afterwards. And I will let Audun talk about Equinor in a second. Of the corporate accelerators, we are based wherever the corporation is, and we bring in founders from all over the world in my case. So we actively look for folks like Rishabh in India, who was in my program this past year, and all the way to from across the entire globe. So we're looking for innovation that is trickling up in countries beyond just the 22 that we're in, but anywhere where we see innovation occurring. I don't know, Audun, if you want to talk a little bit about Equinor, and then I can talk. Then we can open it up on the topic of electrification, which is where my theme is for this year, and energy in general, and go from there. Audun,
Sure.
What do you say?
Thanks, Laila. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, so I run the Equinor and Techstars program, and for those of you who don't know Equinor is kind of one of the largest broad energy companies in the world. They are a Norwegian major state-owned company. And what's special about our program is that it's extremely closely linked with Equinor. So they actually the whole program is inside Equinor offices. You get to rub shoulders with Equinor employees every day over lunch. And what we are trying to do is to foster collaboration between our 10 companies and Equinor. It doesn't always succeed. It doesn't mean that if it doesn't succeed collaborating deal with Equinor, you won't succeed, no way. But we try to really to foster those collaboration with Equinor as close as possible. So if you were to apply to this program, you're actually going to meet myself, of course, and my PM. We're also going to meet both two from Equinor Ventures and two subject matter experts from Equinor before you actually get into this program. So if you get in, you already know that there's a high level of interest for your company at Equinor. So that's the short story, I think, from our program. But as Laila said, we have 50 programs all over the world, and whatever you want to apply to, it actually depends on your interests and what your areas, your company are working in, right? So there's no really pros and cons all over. It depends actually on your area of interest. And Laila and I and all our MDs, we work very closely to figure out where your company fits the best, right? So,
yeah. And when do your applications open and close, and when is your program running?
Yeah, sure. So it opens actually, early next week, and it closes in December. The program then starts in April next year and closes just before summer, June next year.
And my applications are currently open. We are accepting applications through November 23rd, and we're going to be running the program from Valentine's Day, so February 14th through mid-May in Baltimore. And we're doing it in Baltimore because that's where all the battery experts are within Stanley Black & Decker. Just to give a little bit of color to Stanley's background, it's a $15 billion revenue company. They work in industrial spaces, oil and gas, automobiles, fasteners, industrial, healthcare, very, very large business in the tools space. I'm sure some of you might have some of the Black & Decker, Stanley, and Craftsman brands in your garage or your home workbench. So I work very closely with, again, finding companies that might be able to align and do something interesting together with Stanley. So with that, I'm going to kick it off. And actually, Ryan, you talk about hard tech. Tell me a little bit more about hard tech and what you think about hard tech.
Sure, yeah. So for me, hard tech, I would define as things that have a significant amount of technical risk in their business model. And I think that's well contrasted with soft tech or software, which has guided a lot of the innovation and wealth creation in the past couple of decades. And the thing about software and soft tech is you can make a business model innovation, and your ability to build the product to deliver on that innovation is really never in doubt. And it also never costs a lot of capital, and the speed is basically as quick as a competent software engineer can deploy it. Whereas with hard tech, which is basically everything else, there is question about whether you can deliver on your value that you'd like to, whether you can deliver on the value that customers need to see. And there might be like hard physical limits on how quickly that can be done. And it's important to understand that distinction for two reasons. One is that climate change is a hard tech problem because it exists in the worlds of real matter, and we got to solve problems of real matter. And two, understanding that the way you build these businesses and the way that they can be made successful is very different from soft tech, kind of constrains and guides entrepreneurs with how they can expect to succeed and expect to proceed with their hard tech startup.
And I'm not going to make this question and answer. So I know you're nodding, Rishabh, and I also see Audun, you're nodding as well. So just jump in. What do you guys think?
Yeah, definitely. I would like to add on what Ryan mentioned, especially in a robotics company or industries where we are dealing with hardware, software, firmware, all different stacks of the product. The cycle times are usually longer, and it's very essential that we understand who's the right partner that we can start working along with. Understanding the pain point and delivering the product aligned to the partner early on is very important, because early adopters or believers are essentially someone who can help a hard tech company achieve the product, achieve the goal, and then later on scale as the requirements emerge. So yeah, definitely agree with Ryan there that it's not like software where like typically even in our case, like 1 month is just an iteration on a product. Like if you have to change anything on the hardware side, like go into the production, change the software associated with it. So definitely a lot of longer cycle times. But the good thing is we are seeing that industries are emerging who requires or whose pain points are very deep. So they are willing to work along with startups early on to solve those pain points and ensure that, okay, there is progressive growth and scalability after that as well.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that I really love working with Stanley Black & Decker, and I know you do, Audun, as well, is that there is patience here. There's an interest in actually solving problems like manufacturing problems and electrification problems, and how do we actually go and solve those? Those are hard tech, sometimes deep tech problems, right? Those are things that require time. You're touching the physical world, so you're not going to immediately pivot and change and do something different. And it changes the funding environment. It changes how you approach customers. I think one of the things that I try to do in my accelerator is to help entrepreneurs like Rishabh and others meet the potential customers, the people who know the environment that they're selling into and understand the machines that they might be interacting with and the warehouses or manufacturing facilities. So, and I think, Ryan, you also have to have some of that as well, right? Because you're building batteries and you need to understand where those are going, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, having a deep understanding of what the customer needs are is important. That being said, like, batteries aren't super complicated, so it's not like there's a ton of features you can optimize for. It's mostly solving a lot of hard science problems.
Audun, what do you think?
No, it's no need to repeat, but the word pivot comes in here. You mentioned it. I mean, in this world, the hard tech world, the word pivot is actually, it's just no need to talk about, because you can't pivot 10 years of R&D and 5 years of IP patents, right? You can't really pivot them. It's really hard. So sometimes I envy investors who are in the other space where you can just change some source code and then you have a different solution, but you really can't that. But I love impossible tech or deep tech or hard tech. I love that because it's a real challenge and it solves, especially in the climate tech, it solves something that actually matters. I really want to work with something that really matters. That's what brings my passion to this job. Something that really matters. Yeah.
So I have a question here that I'm going to pull in. At what stage of your product development should you speak with potential customers as a hard tech company?
Yeah, I think there's different levels of conversation. So I think early and often, if you want to validate the desire for your product and validate your value proposition, not early if it's promising things to those customers, because what happens very often is the need to show progress results in over-promising to your customers when you don't have line of sight on something you can deliver for them. And if you have to add 1 or 2 learning cycles to your product development, and those learning cycles are measured in months, you're going to disappoint your customer. So I think there's no reason to not talk to customers early and talk about what you want to do, what you want to deliver to them, but just be very careful promising anything if you don't have a lot of certainty you're going to be able to deliver that, because there's only so many customers you can disappoint.
Can I make a comment?
Please, I want you to jump in. This sounds like a question. Let's definitely have a conversation and then jump in.
I think this is one of the also strength about joining an accelerator. I mean, if you're joining Techstars or somebody else, that's a different story. But joining an accelerator of really high quality and high value, you're able to be exposed to mentors that represent big corporations, and you can actually ask these questions in a trusted and friendly setting, right? I think that is one of the strongest things you can do in a program like we're running in Norway, or what you're running, Laila, that you can sit down with people from Stanley and people from Equinor, and they don't actually try to ruin your business, right? They don't try to find mistakes. They're just trying to help. And if you're a clever founder, you can ask the right questions to get that help, to bring your product forward, so you don't have to go through all these cycles later on. I think that's super duper important, and that's also why we pick founders and teams that are extremely good in navigating these complicated processes, and we pick founders that are actually intellectually capable and honest about their mistakes and their strengths. So Ryan is a good example of that in our program.
Yeah, I would say that definitely Stanley, what I try to do when someone like Rishabh comes in, and I'm going to have you talk about it in a moment, Rishabh, is that when there is a complexity, like your case, hardware, software, navigation type of needs as well, is that you need to talk to a lot of different people with expertise. So you can, in a large company, draw different kind of domain expertise to bear. And then there's the mentors. I think, I don't know how many mentors you throw at a poor entrepreneur when they come into your program, but I kind of try to go about 100 mentors per company so that they get the exposure. And those are friendlies, right? You get to Ryan's point earlier, if you don't want to engage with customers yet, you can actually ask a lot of questions from those mentors. And, I kind of bucket the mentors as being folks with domain expertise based on, in our case, the electrification theme. And then folks who have just done it before. I mean, they've been entrepreneurs themselves. Maybe they've been early stage investors for years. They see the patterns that have to be paid attention to and when to do what. And then lastly, I really think that there's also expertise from mentors and what I would call functional expertise. Someone who's incredibly good at sales or knows how to build a sales team. Somebody who really understands pricing models or finance or financial modeling, PR. There's just a whole list of things which I think are just basic business knowledge. And when you're a tiny little company, you can't afford to bring that expertise on board. In fact, you just don't need all of it full time anyway. And so the ability to sort of tap the mentors or even reach into an Equinor or a Stanley and tap some of those experts can really help leverage early on. And you're nodding, so I'm hoping you're agreeing, Rishabh.
No, yeah, absolutely. I think one of the core aspects when we started talking to our customers was always trying to understand what is their pain point, what is their real pain point, what is the top line, what is the bottom line that they're trying to solve. And rather than selling, it's about listening to those requirements that allows us to build the right product. So early on, we also did that mistake when we just went on selling mode. That, hey, we have an awesome robot that can solve all your problems. And I think that was like a different approach, a wrong approach, because we realized that, I'll take an example. We went to an industry and tried selling them like a different solution, completely different solution, completely different zone. But as and when we contacted or we interacted with the team members, we realized they had this bigger pain point, which is the limiting factor of their entire facility. And our product was actually just the right fit for that pain point. So it's like listening to those people on the shop floor, listening to people who are trying to make these decisions, who are trying to improve their productivity, that allows us to target the right solution early on so that we can actually grow with them. And I'll add on to the Stanley program because this was the time that allowed us to understand the pain points, the requirements, the operations from all the different levels, whether it's the IT, whether it's the operational requirements, whether it's the throughput requirements. We were able to talk to different mentors at different level of the industries and understand how each of those stakeholders essentially look at the objectives and how our product that is we are building is aligned to all of those stakeholders. And I think that was one of the most important things, because whenever we bring these changes, it's important that we impact the industry and we are able to add value, which stakeholders are the right ones to guide us to. So yeah.
I'm gonna pull in another question here out of the audience. How have the early customer discussions target price points as part of the conversations? Is that something that you guys do? Audun, how do you feel about that? Would you recommend doing that or not?
Was that pointed towards me or
anyone? I mean, you guys are also like deer in headlights. Oh no, let's not talk pricing.
It depends on the tech, right? I mean, there's some companies we work with are kind of hard tech. You don't have really a price point to discuss yet, and I think again coming back to this safe environment where you can discuss these things in a friendly way, not as a customer versus client situation. I think that's important. But usually the programs or the companies that we work with, they don't have a product ready yet, so it's actually no need to talk about price points yet. Even though I know that Ryan, of course, has made up his own mind of where he has to be, on cost side in order to make money. Of course, that's part of the tech question, but maybe that's a more interesting question. How do you actually calculate, where do you find this beautiful point, right, of price versus what are you going to go to the market with? It's a different conversation. And then maybe Ryan, you can take it further. How are you thinking?
Yeah, I think you don't want to go at advertising precise price points before just kind of along the same vein of not communicating more maturity than you have, not to mislead people, but it's very important to know what price points are being expected now in the future, what different people are willing to pay, because you're going to have to make a commercialization strategy. Once you've solved the tech problems and you have line of sight for commercialization, you will have to make a strategy for what markets you're going to deploy in first, and you should pick the ones that will pay you the most, and being able to correctly identify the right markets that will pay the price you need to allow you to scale up is half the battle. So having those conversations early is important, and some people don't like those conversations because and this was definitely the experience of battery companies from 2010 on, is that they had a tech that in year one made a lot of sense, but then the competitive pricing just changed so quickly that it very quickly became the case that prices were not what was achievable by many people's tech stack. And so I think sometimes the price point information you're getting is not what you want to hear, and you don't want to believe it because it means your company won't work. But unfortunately, like, that's going to catch up with you at some point. So like, better sooner than later.
And I would add that I'm a big believer in, I spend a lot of time with all my entrepreneurs, Rishabh, you probably know this pain, about financial modeling. And that goes to what Audun said earlier. You have to understand what your costs are not only today. Let's say you're a 3-man team and you're doing everything. That's not your price point, your cost overhead, 5 years down the road. You're going to be hiring salespeople and marketing and finance and all sorts of other overheads. So it's really important when you start thinking about pricing to take into account what is the cost of building the business and what's the cost of really delivering on an ongoing basis good product, which often includes customer service and a bunch of other kinds of follow-up that first-time entrepreneurs just say, oh, it cost me this much to build it, I'm just going to sell it for this much plus a little bit more, and not really understanding the need to really, be clear about what that additional overhead cost is and what's your all-in cost for building a product and delivering it. So.
No, I'll definitely add on to that because whenever we try to build a robot, deploy a system, we definitely create these simulations for our robots and the entire solution, right? And one thing we learned via the Techstars program is that costing or financial model is just that simulation. And it's okay, it's going to be wrong, probably the first one that we're going to build, because there are a lot of these assumptions in our model. But it's important that we keep track of those assumptions, and as and when we are having these conversations, keep on updating it so that we can get to a better simulation of our business. So yeah, definitely it's an important aspect to keep in mind, since whenever we start the conversation as well. So yeah, really helpful for our case as well when we try to price robots at different stages in India, in US, how to vary it, what the pricing will change. So yeah.
Cool. I have another question, but this is really something that I'm going to point to you, Audun, because I think it's a broader question about overall interaction with your Equinor and for me, Stanley Black & Decker. So the question is, are there lessons learned around startups working with enterprise organizations, particularly when the organization may not be accustomed to usually working with startups? Right?
Oh, wow. Do you have 2 hours or do you have
Yeah. Exactly. Where do we start and where do we end?
Yeah.
How do we get there?
So I think it's a clear, just as a general comment, unfortunately, startups will probably be surprised just how difficult it is to engage a large corporation. And that doesn't, just go for Equinor or for Stanley Black & Decker, but it's just inherently complicated to penetrate. You might think if you call somebody in an office and you talk to that person, you have a great relationship to that person, you're kind of inside, but you're not. This is like a decision tree. So one of the things that we do when companies are accepted to our program is that we actually make decision trees internally in Equinor. Who is everybody inside this organization? And we create a organizational map of decision makers, who owns which departments, right? And who is a decision maker, who is an influencer, and who actually matters in the organization, and then we target them. And we were lucky to have those people around. But if you don't, then it's actually complicated to get in. But the good news these days is that all organizations now, at least in 2021, they have early entry points into organizations. But the problem again with those channels into large companies is that they are usually flooded. So it doesn't really help because they're just over engaged anyway. So I think the word persistent is key. I mean, the companies that make success in big organizations, they just never give up. They just don't take an offer nonsense. They just do it again and again and again and again. And it's also our job, Laila and my job as MDs here, to actually open doors. And when a founder get a no, well, we challenge, we push, and we help that founder further on to advance the conversations. So it really helps to have somebody like Techstars on your shoulders when you penetrate these organizations, for sure.
And
that was my general answer, Laila. I can spend
that's, no, I know you and I can both spend a lot of time on it. I would just add two things to that. One is startups often think of big companies as being big and lumbering, and that they themselves are fast and nimble. And that's kind of what the venture world is always talking about. But I would actually put out a different framework. Large companies spend a lot more time coordinating. So if you think about what a really top tier company can do, they can, like a Tesla or some other major player, if they put all their resources together, they can build a factory, like a massive factory in months, and then have it up and running with supply chains working quickly. And that involves all sorts of different parts of the organization. So a lot of what large companies are doing, because they're slow, is they're coordinating. They're making sure that all the different parts of the organization can talk to each other. And often they don't, because they're large, right? There's just a lot going on, different business units, different industries, and they're not always all aligned. So one of the things that to reinforce Audun's point about not giving up is that when you get a no from Equinor's one division or a no from one division Stanley, that's not a no from the company. That's a no from that one decision maker in that one particular division over one particular product pitch. And so a lot of this is to do with understanding all the different divisions and all the opportunities. And that's really what Audun and I do. We spend a lot of time understanding what's going on, what are the priorities, who are the individuals looking for what kind of solutions, and then we're trying to match and make. And often that's a long process. I will introduce people like Rishabh early on before we even accept them in the program and have them talk into a division. And it might still take a year or so until the first pilot happens. And part of that has to do with the planning cycles. If someone's doing something really innovative, there's going to be a situation where, first of all, they have to prove the project internally, then they have to budget the project internally, then they have to staff the project internally, and then it happens. And oh, by the way, when you count that all together in a large organization that's coordinating a lot of different things, that just takes time. So anything to add from the founder point of view?
Yeah, I guess given that it takes this much time, make sure you're targeting correctly. It has to be worth it at the end of the day. So don't be, don't make your whole strategy just like talking to a bunch of companies, hoping that someone's going to just find it delightful and bring you on to success. Like, have a specific ask, know what you want. And if what you want isn't so impactful for your business that it's not worth a year of effort, then just hold off on that too. So know that these big companies are big fish to land, and it's going to be a big fight, and just make sure that it's worth it and strategically important at that point.
But also, if I just add one comment to that as well, I mean, also, even though it's fantastic to land a deal with Equinor or with Stanley, my compliments. If you don't, that's okay. It doesn't really matter, right? There's so many other fish to fry out there. At the same time, it's really dangerous to kind of base your whole survival on one of these large organizations, because it just takes too long often. So you need to have multiple channels. And at the same time, large organizations also react surprisingly fast to FOMO, or fear of missing out. So if they see another big logo involved, they all of a sudden move much faster, in a surprisingly way. So it all comes down to they are all humans, right, inside the organization. So we are all,
And that is really why I work really hard, and I know you do too, on getting mentors from different companies. So you're not just coming into the accelerator and having the perspective of only Equinor, of only Stanley Black & Decker. There are many, many mentors, and you can look us all up in our various websites. We have folks that in manufacturing used to work for John Deere, and who are in Caterpillar, and who are at Northrop Grumman and Moog, and some of these are pretty senior people with a lot of knowledge and expertise. And now, as we move towards electrification, we have a brand new group of folks as well that we're working with, and so definitely think about all the different places you can tap, lay a lot of different, opportunities, and work them all simultaneously in parallel. Don't rely on one if you're going to work with a big company. So, all right. I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about what you're focusing on. What kind of companies are you looking for your accelerator? What do you think it's cool? Just give an overview of what you're looking.
Yeah, sure. So it's broadly in four main buckets. It's kind of what we call energy production, which is all about, how do you extract energy? It can also be, renewable, solar, wind, but also oil and gas. That's one part. It's also what we call net zero future, all technologies that drive society towards net zero. That is what we call digital operational enablers. It's a very blurry thing, but it's everything around safety, efficiency, carbon efficiency in operations. How do you actually get down carbon footprint? And then it's the last bucket, maybe my favorite. It's what we call these disruptors. which is everything, right? That's just coming on the horizon, everything that just might come that my brain actually don't comprehend, but it's just coming. So usually it's like founders who are just super ambitious. It can be fusion power, it can be something totally crazy, but it's not crazy, right? It's actually companies that we accept in. We call them moonshots. We usually accept 2-3 of these companies every year. Some of them pan out fantastically, some of them might fail, but that's totally okay, right? So that's the 4 main buckets we're looking for. But at the same time, it's linked quite closely to Equinor. So as mentioned in the beginning, every company that apply, you need to go through multiple interviews, also with us, but also 2 different rounds with Equinor staff, right? So it's pretty long way of getting in here. But I think it matters actually, because then we know we won't waste your time either, right? As a founder, because time is your worst enemy, right? As a startup.
And let me spend a little time talking about Stanley. So Stanley is a $15 billion manufacturing company in a lot of different industries, and they choose themes that reflect what they're doing strategically. So last year we were working very closely, and Rishabh knows this, with the manufacturing, the Industry 4.0 group within Stanley. And this year we're going to be in Baltimore, focusing on electrification. And what we're doing in that instance is really looking at supporting the tools business and the industrial business. And the tools business is everything from what you use in your electric screwdrivers that are getting smarter and more connected, all the way up to snowblowers and grass mowers and things like that, moving those away from combustion engines towards electrification, partially because they're quieter. In some instances, you really do have a lot of noise, partially to be more environmentally safe and sustainable. If you think about a chainsaw, you're aerating tiny pieces of petroleum products all over what you're breathing and your outdoors. So we're trying to replace them with sustainable, biodegradable lubricants, as well as moving away from what's sound and loud and also noisy. Then I think on the industrial side, the focus is really from the fasteners group. So fasteners don't sound very sexy, but it's kind of cool when you think about the fact that 90% of the cars on the road today that you're driving in or riding in were probably assembled and put together either by Stanley robots or rivets and clamps that those robots are using. And so if you think about what that looks like today, it's typically kind of a hybrid where you're just replacing, in electric vehicles, you're just replacing the existing gas tank with a bunch of batteries. But that's not really optimizing the entire structure of the vehicle in a way that would help over time. So we're really kind of beginning to look at, what happens if you're doing what Tesla talks about, which is breaking up the battery and putting it in different places in the car and making it part of the structure of the car. Again, if you're doing all the assembly and the rivets and all the stuff like that, then that becomes important. Needless to say, when you think about combustion engines, they're clamped together and assembled in a way that you can actually take them apart and fix them. Why? Because they're moving parts that are touching each other. You have lubricants and you have coolants and all sorts of things in those engines because they are actually brushing against each other. That's different than an electric vehicle drivetrain where everything's magnetic and moving without necessarily touching. And so, Tesla has a 7-year guarantee. You don't have to bring that electric vehicle drivetrain back for any kind of servicing for 7 years. Combustion engines don't work that way. And so there's the whole infrastructure around that, which includes using some of these Stanley tools that we're talking about in terms of electric screwdrivers and clamps and wrenches and things like that to, be part of that secondary market servicing, both from the service bureaus in terms of the distributors and car makers all the way to your mom and pop shops. And so all of that's changing. What does that look like in the future? If you're actually the company that's riveting everything together, can you add sensors or other things in at the time when you assemble the car together that will make it easier to service? That will change how we service. That will change how we utilize different kinds of tools as well as how we build the car itself. So that's kind of a very big area to think about, and then extend that into now you're looking at the industrial vehicles. You're looking at mining, construction. Obviously, you don't want a combustion engine down in a mine. So what do you want to do there? Thinking about how do you replace hydraulics with electric-based solutions like actuators, and what are the implications of where the intelligence is in those fleets? And really, when you start thinking of industrial vehicles, how And electrification is kind of one step towards autonomous, and then towards fleets that potentially are managed by one operator versus an individual in every single vehicle. So it's pretty exciting times. We're looking for a lot of things in those spaces, and it's I don't know. That's it. And you're nodding. For some of you are nodding. I don't know if that's good, bad. Jump in. What do you guys think? Is this interesting? Is this relevant?
No, I mean, absolutely. I think the one point that you also mentioned is regarding that IT/OT convergence, right? It's going throughout the change. It's not just the large enterprises that want that, but also the small and medium scale mom and pop shops, servicing segments that really want to get on this train so that they can ensure their customers, which are again the large enterprises, and the entire supply chain in this process is connected, is efficient. So yeah, I think electrification, especially if we look over the past 20 years, like whether it's conveyor belts, whether it's incorporation of more and more robots in the industrial lines, whether it's even the older gasoline engines or gasoline devices that used to be present are now completely being shifted into electric devices, not just from the IT/OT side, but also from the perspective that they're easier to maintain. The life cycles are a little bit longer there. So yeah.
And you're building batteries for that. So you want to talk a little bit about batteries?
Yeah, sure. I mean, batteries are a big field. We're trying to do, I guess it's not so small a part, but we're very focused on stationary batteries. So we know that lithium's the best whenever the battery has to move, but it's also a victim of its success. So if you look at what lithium mines can produce over the next decade and what humans need to consume in terms of lithium in order to not destroy the planet, there's a huge mismatch. And so we're just trying to step into that breach with batteries that can be a substitute for lithium with abundant materials. And so it's very exciting to see companies like Stanley go all in on electrifying. We absolutely need to do this to save the planet, because the only way we reduce carbon emissions to zero is to make everything electric and make the electricity clean. And so we're just really excited to see this continued effort from governments, from corporations on electrifying. We're going to be there to help make sure that the electrical system is clean by having batteries that make renewables work.
That sounds very cool. Rishabh, you want to talk a little bit about what you do? I don't know if we ever got into the nitty gritty of what you guys are doing, and I know you're working on cool stuff, both of you. So.
Yeah, so in very essence, we are like an autonomous taxi service for moving material in manufacturing and warehousing. So, but the core aspect is we are not just moving materials, moving these parts in the shop floor, but we are also providing the data associated with them to our customers. So we do work with some of the leading automobile manufacturers in India, and our products are not designed from the perspective of replacing manpower or reducing the labor force, but through the perspective that how the same facility, same size of facility can provide more output. How we can ensure that a warehouse, which is, let's say, like a 2 million square foot, can give more or 50-60% more packages output every single year. And this is something that empowers these industry, not by just reducing the cost, but also ensuring that they don't have to invest in new infrastructure for another 8 years for the growing demands. And that's essentially our focus, like how to increase productivity, but not by replacing humans, but empowering those humans on the field.
I'm going to go for another question here. How does startups sponsor and in case of accelerators, the sponsors work out IP ownership when discussions are out? So, Audun, I'm going to go to you. Can you talk about how Equinor thinks about IP? I'm happy to talk about it, and then I also definitely want the founders to weigh in.
Yeah, it's a complicated question, and it's a very important question. Equinor has actually separate workshops in the beginning of the program with the founders on how to engage with Equinor, because Equinor is terrified of IP collusion. So we actually have a workshop with lawyers from Equinor, how you as a startup should engage in conversations with Equinor. And we always engage on being careful. Don't share things that you're not comfortable with. A lot of founders that are less experienced, they actually get really excited when talking to big corporations, and they might share too much, and that's really not what we want. But I also think that every company can share enough in order to get help. And even if a collaboration evolves into something bigger and better and more, then NDAs are in place. And we also do that in program, right? So it's an organic process. You move from general conversations with a big corporation like Equinor, and then if something evolves in program afterwards, you enter into an NDA stage. And then as an MD, I'm also out of those conversations, right? Because that happens with the corporation and the startup. And I'm glad that it happens, because that means that we actually manage to break through the barrier of communication within a big corporation. So yeah.
I want to pick up on the theme of NDAs. So Stanley and I do as well take NDAs very seriously. Those are non-disclosure agreements. They should be two ways, where both parties disclosing anything are able to identify what's confidential, what they own, and therefore, the conversations don't commingle that. They're very clear. And I think that's really important. When it comes to intellectual property, that's the first step. You really, as Audun said, you don't disclose things that are confidential, that you don't want the world around you to know. Having said that, if you have an issued patent, it's there in writing. So don't start getting paranoid so much that something that's already in the public domain and can be reviewed by anyone is something that you're getting kind of worried about and not engaging perhaps as you should. So once you have an issued patent, I think those kinds of things are already public domain and you're protected. And so, be aware of that very distinct chains in time when you do that. Patents are only just a document that describes a process. There's often a lot of knowledge in people's know-how, as they call it, in the intellectual property world, which resides in the heads of your founders and engineers and inventors. And so those are the things that are actually very important to be aware of where your value is. When I think of intellectual property, like Audun, I spend a lot of time. I bring in experts in that field, and I bring in experts in that field for founders to help us understand what does it cost to file a patent. Everyone seems to want to say, "Oh, I've got patents. That's wonderful." Well, if you only have patents protecting the United States, that's one thing, especially if your competitors might be in Asia. And if you're going to be doing work in Asia, then you're going to have to file in different countries. And then you're going to have to, if you do file in EU, suddenly you're going to have each country having increasingly large fees over the course of the 20 years. So an IP strategy isn't just whether you have intellectual property, it's are you protected on the points that you need? Is it defensive and offensive? And where is that protection and how is that protection going to help you over the long term? And that's a lot of what those conversations are about. Maybe you don't want to file a patent. Maybe you want it to be a trade secret that you just don't talk to people about. It's really important to understand the costs and the trade-offs and when and how you do that. And that's, again, the kind of things that we cover in an accelerator and we bring in experts. But you should protect whatever is really important. I'm sure, Ryan, you probably have patents, and I know, Rishabh, you have some as well. So,
I
what's
wanted
the perspective of founder?
Agree with something Audun said is, of course, be careful when talking about your confidential information, but most conversations, if you're doing something technically amazing, you should be able to describe the value of what you're delivering and give a sense of why it's possible without ever revealing the secret sauce, especially if you're dealing with an audience that's not an expert in your field. There are some people who kind of overcorrect and then they become really cagey about not talking about anything about their technology stack, which, it just kind of betrays ignorance about, what really is patentable and what really is something that you shouldn't talk about. So don't be too afraid. And then otherwise, there is a very real risk that once you start getting grants, once you start working with companies, and you have that relationship and IP comes out during that relationship, that's where the risk of kind of pollution can come in. So in that scenario, just patent early, patent often, and by patent, I mean file provisional applications, get your inventions down quickly, ideally before any of these relationships start, so you can just really draw a line in the sand of what's invented by you and your company before any work starts.
And I would really, really reinforce the notion that sometimes founders become too afraid to discuss anything they do. And then what you're missing out on is that market feedback. that mentor or that key investor or advisor or your first customer, and you don't convince them that what you're doing is interesting because you're too careful. So don't. Yeah. Okay, Audun, go for it.
Just a quick comment to that. I think that's, in our interview process with founders, that's actually a really big red flag for me. If I'm hearing founders, I'm not an expert in anything. If I ask a question and the founder is kind of skeptical, share with me, a non-technical person, then it's really a big red flag, right? Like Ryan says, you have to be able to communicate as a CEO, as a founder, your tech in a very appealing way without asking for an NDA. Yeah. If you do that, I think you're actually on a totally wrong path. And I also know that for a lot of investors, if you go and ask for an NDA early, it's one of the biggest turnoffs you can do, right? Yeah. I mean, investors have 2,000 companies to talk to, and they're just going to say next company. They're just going to pass on you, right? So it's really important that you as a founder are able to communicate this in an appealing way very early without disclosing any secrets.
Right, and I'll reinforce that by saying, as an investor, I'm not interested necessarily in the nitty-gritty of the invention, which is what a patent protects. I'm interested in how large is that opportunity? Are you as a team going to be able to execute? What does it cost to bring it to market? And who are your competitors and substitutes? I mean, those are the basics of trying to assess what you're doing. And you don't need to go into a lot of detail to make those sense. Any other?
Yeah, I'll just add to that definitely like system architecture or describing how the product works, how the tech works from the user perspective has always been a big plus for us, because all our patent that we have developed, we are always able to bring it from the perspective that what is the real value that the users get out of these technologies. And I think once you do that, it's easier to explain it to them that how that system in itself is working that is providing this value. Also, another thing that I would definitely mention, like since we are operating in Asia where patent laws might not be that strict as somewhere around in Europe or America, it's also important for companies like us, especially, that once we give out the product, we are also careful how the system has been designed so that not all the technology is in the hand of the user. So whether it's depending on shifting some of these areas or incorporating in the layers of hardware, software, so making it more difficult for the technology in itself to be easily replicable. Especially in case of our robots, it's not just one, I'll take an example, it's not just one hardware design that is allowing us to develop some of these technologies. It's a combination of that hardware and the software stack that allows us to bring it. And that's how we are able to, and more patents that we generate, we try to couple them together so that it's harder for the other companies who are trying to compete in this space or copy that particular design.
So I'm going to switch topics to a tough one. Funding hard tech. Obviously, Audun and I are willing to give up to $120,000 for the accelerator, but I don't think it takes $120,000 to build all and develop the battery and full robots. So what do you guys think about funding? And Audun, Ryan, Rishabh?
I always like to, with my team, like before batteries, I was working in finance, so I knew financial math, and I like to walk through the very cold, unforgiving logic of financial math. And if you view investments as needing to compete with each other on a return basis, what that means for a hard tech company. And honestly, I think this is where a lot of the hard tech companies go wrong, is if you're going to do something really hard, if it's going to take you a long time to get to market, if you're going to need a bunch of capital to build your first factory to get to first revenue, there's only one way to make that work, which is go after a massive problem and have a huge TAM and have a story that okay, it's going to take us this many years. We're going to have to do a few rounds. Yes, we're going to have to deploy capital, but at the other end of that is a $100 billion plus market. That's a story that can work. If you're saying, I just graduated from a lab, it's going to take me this many years, it's this brand new material, and we're able to help this very small process in some niche thing that I encountered in my lab, there's just no way that's going to work. So, funding hard tech is hard, but it also fits within the framework that at the end of the day, you just need to be able to make a really, really compelling business. And unfortunately, hard tech means that it's going to take you longer to build it. It's going to take you more capital before you get to sales. There's going to be more learning cycles, but you can still make that financial math work if you have a massive TAM and a massive opportunity, and hopefully like good profitability.
Yeah, on the other end, I would also say that having some of the early adopters helps a lot. So whenever we are trying to raise or we are talking to investors, some of the early adopters that we are able to generate because of the early product itself, right? Like if the, as Ryan mentioned, if the problem is big enough, there will be early adopters. And if we are able to capture those early adopters, starting to work along with them, it becomes like an easier road, not as simple as a software company for sure for a hard tech, but definitely like way more easier because now we are not proving whether our tech is genuine or not. Now we are not proving whether the problem we are solving is genuine or not, because there is some adopter who is willing to take our tech and has a big problem enough that is willing to pay us, right? So I think that helps a lot in the fundraising cycles for sure.
I would say the other thing that I see is the governments and agencies getting involved. There's a lot of grants that are coming out around from clean tech organizations that I think are helping, particularly in electrification on some of the energy areas. And those are definitely worth exploring and understanding and going after. In the United States, and I'll let Audun talk about EU because I know they have some similar programs, there are very specific things called SBIR, which is Small Business Initiative kind of grant processes with the government, and they have a bunch of variants of that, which can end up being tens of millions of dollars. I mean, they started at 50,000 level, then you have to prove something, and you have to prove some more. But there are also ways in which some of that with matching venture capital investment can be leveraged and even multiplied. So there's ways to fund the company which are what I would call non-dilutive, which don't necessarily bring in equity investors until you've gotten past a certain point of risk, where you might even have a customer in the government, you might even have it employed in the field. And I would really encourage in hard tech to do that, because that's a good way to sort of engage, build something, be able to build more than one of it, and get to the point where then you can start exploring and have somebody to show as a prototype or as a product when you engage in the commercial markets. So I don't know, Audun, what you'd say about EU as well. I think they have grants as well, right?
Yes, I mean EU is. There's grants in, of course, every country, right? But the thing I want to add here is maybe if you are working on climate tech and climate solutions, there's of course a tidal wave of money also being poured in that direction, particularly in the last 2, 3, 4 years, which is I find extremely interesting. And I'm super passionate about helping companies that try and take a little stab at various problems around climate tech, but the problem is just so large. We need just everything, right? Every company. They're so difficult, but the amount of money flowing into this sector is becoming insane at the moment. So one of my concerns now is that we are creating a bubble, an inflation bubble also among companies. But maybe that's a different topic. I'll take another hour to talk about. But we are at an interesting point at the moment, I think, when it comes to valuations also on startups. I'm hearing some stories that I don't want to even talk about here, but when 3 persons and you're valued at $40 million. Yeah, well, Ryan, it's good when you are racing in a upwards market, but at one point this will stop, right? And then you will have a down run. Yeah. It's not applicable to you, but as a general.
We have a running list of all the overvalued and sometimes now publicly traded battery companies that we just know are vaporware, and we're like, okay, well, the party's good now, but at some point all these are going to go to zero, and then everyone's going to be sad on the sector. I did want to add something that was said earlier about getting early adoption. If you're doing science risk, you don't have the opportunity to get early adoption in the first 3 years, but you can do something similar, which is get SBIRs, get corporate grants, get things that show you're actually making progress on your product as evaluated by experts in your field, because those things are very valuable when you want to go to private investors who don't understand the science, because most investors you go to early stage, say it's like an angel, whatever, they will have no way of knowing whether what you're saying is completely made up, whether it's BS. But if you bring them tangible things that show you're credible, show you're making progress, whether that's a paper in a peer review journal that's really credible, or the completion of these grants, they will be able to have confidence that you're really onto something.
Good point. So we are coming up to the hour, and I always like to have everyone involved give their kind of last thoughts. And that could be anything from what do you think is really cool and happening in energy, electrification, batteries, autonomous robots or robotics in general. What's really cool, exciting? What would you want the listeners to be left with as a thought? And you can all jump
I'll
in
go
at
first.
once.
Mine's not happy. So it's been about 30 years since the global consensus on the urgency and threat of climate change, and we've about doubled our annual CO2 emissions. And if you look at every published pathway for reducing CO2 emissions, almost all of them assume failure. So whether it's the McKinsey estimates, the BP estimates, everyone assumes that we're emitting a ton of CO2 by 2050. So I guess this is a crisis, treated as a crisis. As Audun said, we need all hands on deck. And basically, if everyone in the audience dedicated their life to making clean tech amazing and making it work and making climate change go forward, there's still a high likelihood that we'll have, unacceptable climate change, because that's how messed up our position is because of prior generations. But we still need to do everything we can. So let's treat this as a crisis. Let's treat this as an all hands on deck thing. Do the ambitious thing, aim for transformation, because at this point, playing small ball is just not worth it.
Wow. Audun, you want to climb on that? I know you're passionate about this as well.
So we should probably end on a easy note and be happy when we end, but I actually don't want to do that. I want to just echo what Ryan said. I mean, I think we all just need to understand a little bit more about the amount of disaster ahead of us. And there's a lot of people out there who recycle all their paper and they buy a second car, a second Tesla, because then they think they can fly more around. And I think people just have to realize just the scale of the problem at the moment. I don't think people actually understand it, or they don't want to understand it psychologically. And I get that, but I think we all need to understand that we cannot live like we do right now. We have to do something way more than buying a Tesla or recycle your paper, because that doesn't really matter. We have to do so much more. And helping, founders, I'm not saying that Ryan will save the world, but, working with a battery or something that matters here, that's what drives me, basically. But it's a small thing, but if everybody or a lot of people channel their energy into that, that'll make a difference for sure.
Yeah, I actually am very much in the belief that a lot of things can, first of all, innovation can make a difference, and the founders that are passionate, like Ryan and Audun and you and I, and everyone else who's trying to change the world. Techstars believes that entrepreneurs can change the world, and we are fundamentally committed to doing that. And energy and electrification and climate are very, very much top of mind. Sustainability across all aspects of what we do in industrial, particularly where I work, is very important for Stanley and Decker. I keep getting reminded of the big hole that was over Australia, and then we outlawed the kinds of gases that were actually creating some of those holes, and it closed. So the Earth can heal itself, and we as entrepreneurs can also come up with great solutions, but we do need to commit to do those things. And so I think we just need to all hands, but I also think we can make change. And if you really work at it, that can happen. So
MIT is developing a fusion reactor at the moment, right? And it's getting better at MIT. So, let's hope, maybe.
We'll get there. No, I think we will, because we have to, right? The other alternative is not an option. All right, Rishabh, we now have following this big incentive that everything's being given and challenged. What would you say as a closing remark to that, or as a closing remark?
Be positive.
What's that? Good. On what?
I was joking. Try to be a positive.
Yeah. You have to. You're upbeat. You've got to be the upbeat guy.
No, I was actually gonna point that picture as well. So growing up, I actually belong from a manufacturing background, from a small one, right? So I saw how things were made, and even 20 years after that, like since my dad has his own manufacturing unit, and after 20 years of watching this, it's still the same way. So if we have to fundamentally change how our energy requirements, our production systems are going to adapt, it's important that it's not just the large enterprises that are going to adopt these technologies, electrifying their operations, improve the productivity of these operations. It's throughout the world, from small and medium scale industries to large scale industries, that we have to empower. And once we start providing solutions for those small scales, I think we can start seeing the impact way more in how we produce the things. And yeah, so definitely there's a scope. Like I belong from a state which is the most sun kind of like consuming state kind of thing. So I've seen that we have shifted to solar energy quite a bit. And now even in like my dad's factory and like our home and all, now we are all solar panel system. But definitely still need way more steps to ensure that everything is streamlined, everything is more productive and streamlined in the process. So yeah.
Perfect. Thank you for that. I will simply end by saying thank you all for coming. Thank you also, Audun and Rishabh and Ryan, for getting up early, particularly Ryan, because you got up super early to join us. And I would encourage anyone who is an entrepreneur, please take a look at all the Techstars accelerators. Obviously, I'd love to have you apply to Stanley or Equinor, but definitely consider what you can do to make a change and get involved. So look forward to hearing from you. Take care. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.